We gaze upon the ruins of Rome and see power. We see the Colosseum, a monument to spectacle and slaughter. We see the aqueducts, stone arteries that carried the lifeblood of a civilization across valleys and plains. We see the stoic, marble faces of emperors and senators, their sculpted visages promising order, law, and an enduring strength that would shape the Western world. This is the Rome of legend, the Rome of textbooks, an empire of warriors, engineers, and orators. But behind the cold marble and the grand pronouncements, within the opulent, frescoed walls of the patrician domus, existed a different kind of empire. It was a silent, gilded dominion built not on territory, but on flesh, not on legions, but on the quiet, subjugated suffering of the beautiful. This was the world of the male concubine, the pure delicatus, the delicate boy, whose existence exposes a truth far more unsettling than the roar of the arena or the clash of swords. It reveals a rot at the core of Roman grandeur, a story not of conquest, but of consumption. To understand this world is to peel back the veneer of Roman virtus, that celebrated ideal of manliness, discipline, and public duty, and confront the profoundly private and often depraved appetites that it masked. We must ask a difficult question. What was the life of a human being whose sole purpose was to be a beautiful object, a living work of art for the pleasure of a powerful master? How did a civilization that prided itself on strength and martial prowess cultivate a system predicated on the methodical breaking of young men, on the forced preservation of an unnatural, fleeting youth? The story of the Roman male concubine is not merely a footnote to history. It is a vital and horrifying chapter about the true nature of power. It is an exploration of how absolute authority inevitably leads to the commodification of humanity, where individuals are stripped of their names, their pasts, and their very souls, all to satisfy the whims of an elite that saw the world and everyone in it as their rightful property. This, then, is not a story of emperors and battles. It is the story of the silent and the erased. It is an attempt to give voice to the boys who were trained to be voiceless, to reconstruct a life from the chillingly casual references left by poets, satirists, and moralists who saw them as little more than status symbols or cautionary tales. We will journey into the heart of the Roman home, a place that was both a sanctuary of patriarchal power and a prison of exquisite cruelty. We will trace the path of a boy from freedom to enslavement, from individual to object, and in doing so, we will uncover the human cost of empire, a price paid not in gold or territory, but in the slow, grinding destruction of the human spirit. The grand narrative of Rome is incomplete without this dark, intimate, and deeply tragic counterpoint. To comprehend the tragic trajectory of a Roman male concubine, one must first understand the world from which he was often violently torn. Imagine a boy, let us call him Lycos, living not in the sprawling, chaotic heart of Italy, but in a sun-drenched Greek city in Asia Minor. This is a world that, while certainly not a paradise of universal freedom, possessed a different texture of life. Lycos' childhood would have been defined by the rhythms of his community, the smell of the Aegean Sea, the chatter of the agora, the dust of the gymnasium where boys like him trained their bodies and minds. His identity was woven from the threads of his family, his city, and a cultural heritage that stretched back to Homer and Plato. He was not yet a commodity. He was a son, a brother, a friend. His future, though perhaps humble, was his own to imagine. He might have become a potter, a merchant, or perhaps even a philosopher, his days governed by the pursuit of a craft, the raising of a family, and the duties of a citizen. This life, with its web of connections and its promise of a future, existed in the shadow of a colossal, ever-expanding power. Rome. To the people in the provinces, Rome was a distant, ominous concept, a behemoth whose legions marched with terrifying efficiency. For generations, Roman expansion had been a geopolitical reality, but for Lycos, it was the stuff of travelers' tales and the nervous whispers of elders. The crisis, when it came, was not a slow diplomatic unraveling, but a brutal, swift cataclysm. The arrival of Roman soldiers was the sound of a world ending. It was the splintering of doors, the screams of neighbors, the smell of fire and blood. In the chaos of the city's fall, Lycos' life, as he knew it, was annihilated. Family ties were severed not by choice or time, but by the sword and the slave-catcher's rope. He was no longer Lycos, son of Ariston. He was captured property. It is here, in the moment of capture, that the Roman system of values asserted itself with chilling clarity. While a strong, hardy man might be destined for the mines or the galleys, and a plain woman for domestic drudgery, a boy of exceptional beauty like Lycos was singled out for a different fate. His physical perfection, once a simple fact of his youth, now became his defining characteristic, his curse. Slave traders, men with a keen eye for human livestock, would have inspected him with a cold, calculating gaze. They were not looking for strength or resilience, but for flawless skin, symmetrical features, a graceful posture, the raw materials of a pure delicatus. He was now part of the vast, horrific human supply chain that fed the appetites of the empire's core. His journey to Rome would have been a disorienting nightmare, packed into the hold of a ship with hundreds of other souls, each a fragment of a shattered world. The shared language of their grief was the only thing that bound them. To understand what awaited Lycos in Rome, we must dissect the Roman attitude towards sexuality and slavery, for it was at the intersection of these two concepts that the institution of the male concubine flourished. Unlike the idealized Greek model of pederasty, which, at least in theory, involved a mentorship between a freeborn citizen and an adolescent, the Roman practice was stripped of nearly all philosophical pretense. For the Romans, the defining factor in a sexual relationship was not gender, but power and status. A freeborn Roman male citizen could engage in sexual acts with almost anyone of a lower social standing. Slaves, prostitutes, gladiators, without any significant moral condemnation, provided he was the active, dominant partner. To be the penetrator was to affirm one's virtus, one's manliness and authority. To be penetrated, however, was to be feminized, to be socially degraded. This was an unthinkable humiliation for a Roman citizen, but it was the prescribed role for a slave. A slave, in Roman law and society, was not a person. They were res, a thing, an object legally equivalent to a chair or a farming tool. They had no rights, no bodily autonomy, and no legal recourse against any form of abuse, sexual or otherwise. A master could do whatever he wished to his slave without consequence. It is within this brutal legal and social framework that the pure delicatus existed. He was the ultimate luxury good, a testament to his owner's wealth and refined taste. Poets like Martial and Statius wrote of these boys, sometimes admiringly, sometimes with a sneer, describing their pampered lives, their expensive clothes, and the jealousy they inspired. The ownership of a stunningly beautiful boy from Greece or the East was a mark of immense status, akin to owning a rare piece of art or a thoroughbred horse. But unlike a statue, this work of art was breathing, feeling, and suffering. The master's public display of his concubine was a display of his power, the power to own beauty, to command it, and ultimately to consume it. The turning point for our archetypal boy, Lycos, was the slave market in Rome. Here, the final vestiges of his former identity were publicly stripped away. He would have been placed on a rotating platform, naked, so that potential buyers could inspect every inch of his body. His teeth were checked, his skin prodded, his limbs examined for any imperfection. Buyers, wealthy senators and equestrians, would circle him, discussing his merits and flaws in cold, detached Latin, a language he barely understood. This process was the quintessence of dehumanization. It was the formal transition from a human being into a product, his value determined solely by his aesthetic appeal and his potential to gratify a master's desires. When a wealthy patrician, perhaps a general famed for his military victories or a senator known for his stern public pronouncements on Roman morality, finally purchased him for an exorbitant price. Lycos' fate was sealed. He was led from the chaos of the market to the suffocating quiet of a private villa, stepping across a threshold into a new and terrifying existence. The boy from Greece was gone, and in his place was a creature whose only purpose was to be beautiful, compliant, and silent. Once inside the walls of the Roman Domus, the process of transformation began. It was not a gentle acclamation, but a systematic dismantling of his previous self and the construction of a new persona designed entirely around the master's pleasure. This was a psychological breaking in as much as a physical one. First, his name, Lycos, the last link to his family and his past, was erased. He would be given a new, Latinized name, something delicate or evocative like Ganymedes or Hyacinthus, names drawn from myths of beautiful boys beloved by the gods. This act of renaming was a powerful assertion of ownership, a declaration that his old identity was null and void. He was now a character in his master's private theater. His education was a perverse re-engineering of his mind. If he knew Greek, as many boys from the East did, this was a valuable asset, allowing him to recite poetry or engage in light, pleasing conversation. But he was forced to learn Latin, the language of his servitude. He was not taught rhetoric or philosophy to develop his own thoughts, but to better understand and anticipate the commands of his master in the household. He was trained in the arts of servitude, how to pour wine without spilling a drop, how to stand silently for hours, how to arrange his face into a mask of serene contentment, regardless of his inner turmoil. Every aspect of his being was meticulously curated. His hair was kept long and styled in elaborate fashions, often perfumed with expensive oils. His skin was kept smooth and pale, a process that often involved painful and constant hair removal through plucking or harsh depilatory creams. He was bathed, massaged, and adorned in fine silks and jewelry, a living doll for his owner's amusement. The physical regimen was relentless, a paradox of pampered imprisonment. His diet was carefully controlled, designed not for health or strength, but to maintain a specific adolescent physique, slender, soft, and free of rugged masculinity. Any deviation, any sign of unwanted weight gain or muscle development could be met with harsh punishment. He was caught in a terrible trap. His existence depended on maintaining an image of youth that time itself was destined to destroy. This created a constant, gnawing anxiety. Every look in a polished bronze mirror was a search for the first signs of decay, the first encroaching shadow of manhood that would signal the end of his value. The satirist Juvenal wrote with scorn of the masters who would fly into a rage at the first sight of a bristling beard on their favorites, lamenting the loss of their smooth-skinned boy for the concubine. This natural process was not a rite of passage, but a death sentence for his privileged position. His days were a structured monotony of pleasing. He might be required to attend his master at dinner parties, the convivium, where he would stand by the couch, fanning him, serving him wine, and enduring the lecherous gazes and drunken remarks of the guests. He was a piece of decor, a topic of conversation, his beauty a reflection of his owner's status. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring his master's moods, his desires, his slightest whims. A frown could mean punishment. A smile meant a temporary reprieve. This dynamic created a profound and toxic dependency. While he was surrounded by luxury, he was utterly powerless. He had no friends, only rivals. Other slaves in the household might view him with a mixture of envy for his material comforts and contempt for his role. A younger, more beautiful boy recently acquired by the master was not a potential companion, but a mortal threat, a harbinger of his own obsolescence. Any act of defiance, however small, a sullen expression, a moment of hesitation, a flash of his true feelings, was met with swift and brutal correction. The same hand that might gently stroke his cheek in a moment of feigned affection could just as easily strike him across the face for a perceived slight. This unpredictability was a potent tool of control. It kept him emotionally off balance, desperate to please and terrified to offend. He learned to dissociate, to retreat into a protected corner of his own mind while his body performed the duties required of it. He perfected the art of the empty smile, the compliant nod, the silent endurance. His inner world, filled with memories of a lost home and a grief he could never express, was his only sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary under constant siege from the demands of his present reality. The gilded cage was in every meaningful way a torture chamber for the soul. The life of a male concubine was an exercise in arrested development, a desperate battle against the inexorable march of time. His value was predicated entirely on youth, and so his existence became a frantic effort to preserve it. This struggle was not his own choice. It was a mandate enforced by his master, whose vanity and desire were projected onto the boy's body. The methods used were often elaborate, invasive, and underscored the complete lack of bodily autonomy afforded to him. The obsession with smoothness, for instance, was paramount. Roman ideals of male beauty for these favorites leaned heavily towards the androgynous. Body hair was considered coarse and animalistic, a mark of the rugged soldier or the common laborer, not the delicate creature of the domus. Consequently, the boy endured a daily or weekly regimen of depilation. This could involve squads of slaves using tweezers, valselli, to pluck out individual hairs, a slow and agonizing process. Alternatively, they might use resinous waxes or harsh chemical concoctions, known as solathrum, which were often caustic and could leave the skin raw, irritated, and prone to infection. The constant pain was simply part of the cost of being beautiful. Cosmetics, typically associated with women, were also a key part of his daily ritual. Chalk or white lead might be used to lighten his complexion, creating the pale, indoor look that signaled a life of leisure, far from the sun's browning rays. Unfortunately, white lead was a deadly neurotoxin, and its slow, cumulative poisoning could lead to neurological damage, paralysis, and madness. His cheeks might be rouged to give a blush of youthful health, and his eyes subtly lined with kohl. These were not acts of self-expression, but applications of a uniform, a mask that hid his true state and presented a perfect, artificial facade to his owner and the world. He was being sculpted and painted daily, less a person and more a canvas for his master's aesthetic preferences. Beyond the physical upkeep, there were the failed attempts to regain some semblance of control, moments where the crushing reality of a situation sparked small, futile acts of rebellion. Perhaps, in a moment of despair, he might refuse to eat the rich foods designed to keep him soft, and attempt to assert control over the one thing that was still his own body. Such an act would not be seen as a cry for help, but as insubordination. The consequences would be severe: a flogging, confinement, or the withdrawal of all privileges, a stark reminder that even his own flesh was not his to govern. Or perhaps he might form a clandestine bond with another slave, sharing a whispered word in their native Greek, a fleeting moment of solidarity. If discovered, this too would be punished. The system was designed to keep him isolated. Friendships were dangerous. They fostered loyalty to someone other than the master and could lead to conspiracies. He was meant to be entirely dependent, his entire social and emotional world revolving around one person, his owner. The impact of his presence rippled through the entire household, creating a unique and often toxic social ecosystem. To the master's wife, the matrona, he was a constant, living insult. She, a noble Roman woman, was there to manage the household and produce legitimate heirs. Her role was one of duty and dignity. The boy concubine represented a different kind of intimacy, one based on illicit desire and aesthetic obsession, and he often received a level of pampering and attention that was denied to her. While a Roman wife had to tolerate her husband's affairs with slaves, the blatant, public parading of a beautiful boy within her own home was a source of deep humiliation and resentment. Her hatred, though she might have to suppress it, would be a palpable force in the house, another source of danger for the boy. The psychological toll of this existence was devastating and cumulative. The boy, Lycos, slowly forgot the person he once was. The memories of his childhood in Greece became dreamlike, hazy, and painful to recall. To survive, he had to kill his past self. He developed what we might now call complex post-traumatic stress disorder. He would be prone to bouts of deep melancholy, what the Romans called tristitia, for which there was no cure but to perform his duties more perfectly. He might experience a profound sense of derealization, a feeling that his life was not real, that he was merely watching a character perform on a stage. Paranoia would be a constant companion. Was the master tiring of him? Did that new slave boy from Syria receive a more appreciative glance? Was the cook putting something in his food on the Matrona's orders? This constant state of fear, anxiety, and dissociation was not a sickness. It was the logical endpoint of the system. It was the price of survival in the gilded cage. His spirit was being systematically eroded, leaving behind only a beautiful, hollow shell, waiting for the inevitable day when a crack would appear and he would be discarded. The climax of a male concubine's life was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, creeping horror dictated by biology. For the boy whose entire worth was tied to his prepubescent or adolescent beauty, the onset of manhood was the ultimate crisis, the point of no return. It began subtly, a slight deepening of his voice, once clear and high, now holding a lower, rougher timbre. A new shadow on his upper lip that even the most diligent plucking could not entirely erase. The soft contours of his face beginning to harden, his jawline becoming more defined. These are the natural markers of a boy becoming a man, but in the perverse economy of the Roman domus, they were signs of spoilage, the decay of a priceless commodity. This biological clock ticked with the dreadful finality of an executioner's countdown. Our archetypal boy, now a young man in his late teens, would have watched these changes in his own body with a mounting sense of terror. Every morning's reflection in a polished silver mirror was an exercise in dread. He would feel his own body betraying him, transforming him from a desirable object into something coarse and unwanted. His desperation would have been palpable. He might have resorted to more extreme, frantic measures to hide the inevitable. Perhaps he tried to speak in a higher register, a pathetic attempt to mimic the voice he was losing. He might have pleaded with the slaves who groomed him to be more aggressive with the tweezers, to scour his skin raw in the hopes of holding back the tide of masculinity. Seneca the Younger wrote with contempt of such figures, the exoleti, the men who have gone out of fashion, who desperately tried to wage war with nature to prolong their careers. During this period of decline, the behavior of his master would have shifted dramatically. The feigned affection, the indulgent smiles, the gifts of jewelry and silk, all would begin to evaporate. In their place would come a coldness, a critical eye that now found fault in everything. A compliment on his beauty would be replaced by a sneer about the stubble on his chin. The master's own vanity was wounded. The boy's aging was a personal affront, a reminder of mortality and a failure of his power to halt nature. The master, a powerful Roman senator or general, was accustomed to bending the world to his will, but he could not command a boy's hormones to cease their work. This impotence would often manifest as cruelty towards the boy himself, who became the scapegoat for the master's frustration. The atmosphere in the household would grow thick with a predatory tension. Younger slaves, beautiful boys of 12 or 13, recently purchased from the markets in Ephesus or Alexandria, would be brought into the domus. They were the new, unblemished models. The aging concubine would be forced to watch as the master's attention, the sole source of his security and status, was transferred to a new favorite. He would see the younger boy receiving the fine clothes he once wore, sleeping in the small antechamber to the master's bedroom that he once occupied. The other slaves, once perhaps fearful or envious of him, would now treat him with a chilling indifference or open scorn. They knew his fall was imminent. He was no longer a figure of influence, but a ghost, a walking relic of a desire that had passed. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and he was in absolute freefall, watching his replacement smile with the same practiced innocence that he himself had perfected years before. This was the point of no return. The moment he ceased to be a pure delicatus and became merely a slave, his one valuable attribute now gone forever. The moment the master's gaze settled definitively on a new favorite, the fall of the former concubine was swift and merciless. There was no gentle retirement, no severance package for years of service. The Roman system of slavery was ruthlessly practical. An object that had lost its primary function was either repurposed or discarded. The immediate aftermath was one of profound and shocking demotion. One day, he was sleeping on soft linens and eating delicacies from the master's table. The next, he was cast out of the patrician's private quarters and sent to the slave barracks, the ergastulum, a place he may have only seen from a distance. The fine silks and jewels were stripped from him, replaced by the coarse, rough-spun tunic of a common laborer. The silence that had been his professional virtue was now the silence of social invisibility. He was no longer seen. What then became of him? His fate depended on the whims of the master and the cold logic of economics. Several grim paths lay before him. If he was lucky, and if his master felt a flicker of what might pass for sentimentality, he might be given a position within the urban household. He could become a porter, a litter-bearer, or a footman. Physically demanding, menial jobs where his former status would be a source of constant humiliation. Every day, he would have to see his replacement, the new favorite, living the life that was once his. Every command from the master would be a sharp reminder of his fall from grace. The other slaves would likely torment him, taking pleasure in ordering around the man who was once above them. A far more common and brutal fate was to be sold. His value on the open market was now a fraction of what it once was. No longer a luxury item, he was now just a body assessed for its strength. He could be sold to the owner of a lupanar, a brothel, where his past as a high-class concubine would be a perverse selling point. Here, the pretense of romance and aesthetics was gone, replaced by the brutal, transactional reality of sexual exploitation. He would be forced to serve countless men, his body no longer a private treasure, but a public commodity, used until it was broken. This was a descent into the deepest circles of Roman hell, a world of violence, disease, and utter despair. Alternatively, and perhaps even more feared, he could be sold to work in the country. This might sound bucolic, but a Roman agricultural estate, a latifundium, was often little more than a slave labor camp. He would be sent to the fields, to the olive groves, or worst of all, to the mines. The back-breaking labor under a scorching sun, or in the suffocating darkness of a mine shaft, was a death sentence for a body conditioned to a life of pampered softness. His hands, once soft and smooth, would become calloused and torn. His health would quickly fail. In the mines, life expectancy was measured in months, not years. He would be chained, whipped, and worked to death, his final resting place an unmarked grave, his existence reduced to a line item in a ledger. There were no cover-ups or propaganda efforts concerning his fate because nothing that happened was considered wrong. The disposal of a former favorite was an unremarkable event, a routine part of managing household assets. A master's friends might comment on his exquisite new boy, but no one would ask what became of the old one. The boy's erasure was total and socially sanctioned. His story ended not with a bang, but with a silent, indifferent shrug from the society that had created and destroyed him. His very existence was a form of propaganda for his master's power, and his disposal was the final, logical expression of that power. He was a seasonal flower, beautiful for a time, then left to wither and be swept away without a second thought. The system did not need to hide what it did. Its cruelty was open, accepted, and an integral part of the fabric of Roman life. The final act of his tragedy was that it was not considered a tragedy at all. The long-term consequences of this brutal system were etched into the very character of the Roman Empire, though the individual stories of the boys were almost entirely lost to history. The institution of the male concubine perpetuated a cycle of conquest, exploitation, and dehumanization that was a microcosm of the empire's broader operations. Each beautiful boy snatched from a conquered province was a living symbol of Roman domination, his servitude a constant, intimate reminder of his people's subjugation. This practice did not merely affect the individuals. It normalized a profound hypocrisy at the heart of Roman society. An elite class that spoke endlessly of republican virtues, of discipline, and of moral fiber privately engaged in a form of systematized child abuse, cloaking it in the language of aesthetics and status. This moral dissonance, this chasm between public pronouncements and private behavior, contributed to the very decadence that Roman moralists like Seneca and Tacitus would later decry, often without fully acknowledging the role their own class played in fostering it. When we look back through the lens of history, the interpretation of this practice has shifted dramatically. For centuries, classicists, often working within a cultural framework that romanticized all things Greco-Roman, might have downplayed its brutal realities, focusing on the poetry it inspired or framing it as a simple expression of bisexuality. But a modern, critical analysis can't afford no such sanitization. We now rightly identify it for what it was: institutionalized slavery and sexual exploitation, often of minors. The surviving historical sources, when read critically, support this grim view. The poet Martial, for instance, writes with a casual, almost journalistic tone about the buying and selling of these boys, his verses filled with details about their prices, their physical attributes, and the anxieties of their owners. He treats them as he would any other luxury good. The Stoic philosopher Seneca the Younger, while condemning the practice on moral grounds, speaks of it as a widespread and deeply ingrained custom, describing with disgust the flocks of catamites that thronged the homes of the wealthy. His critique is not of a rare perversion, but of a societal norm. These accounts, intended as satire or moral critique, serve today as damning testimony, providing the evidence for a crime for which there were no contemporary trials. The ultimate moral lesson from the silent tragedy of the pure delicatus is a stark and timeless one. It is a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute, unchecked power. When one human being can hold total dominion over another, the capacity for empathy erodes, and the other person ceases to be seen as a fellow human, becoming instead a tool, an object, or a canvas for the owner's desires. The story serves as a profound reflection on human fragility, not just of the victim, but of the perpetrator, whose own humanity was diminished by the act of owning another. The boy concubine stands as a symbol of innocence lost, a testament to the fact that the most profound cruelties are often not committed in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, private spaces where power operates without witness or restraint. This brings us to the fundamental contrast between Rome's public image and its private reality. We see the majestic arches of triumph celebrating victories over foreign kings, but we fail to see the human spoils of those victories, the children like Lycos, whose lives were destroyed to furnish the villas of the victors. We admire the intricate floor mosaics depicting scenes from mythology, but we do not see the terror in the eyes of the boy forced to stand beside them, himself a mythological reference made flesh. The enduring myth of Rome, its glory, its order, its law, was built upon a foundation of countless, forgotten acts of private brutality. The grandeur of the empire was not just paid for in taxes and tribute, but in the stolen childhoods and shattered souls of its most vulnerable subjects. In the end, we are left with a profound and haunting silence. The boys themselves left no diaries, no letters, no testimony. Their experiences are filtered entirely through the words of their masters, their admirers, and their critics, men who saw them as property, pets, or symbols of moral decay. Their individual hopes, fears, and sorrows are lost to us, buried under 2 millennia of history. And yet, this very silence is their most powerful legacy. It is an indictment of a system that so thoroughly erased them that we must now piece together their existence from fragments and shadows. The true story of Rome is not just in the ruins of the Forum, but in the ghosts that haunt the empty spaces of the historical record. In remembering the forgotten boy in the gilded cage, we are forced to confront a more complete and disturbing picture of the empire, and to acknowledge that the price of greatness is often a cost too terrible to bear, paid by those who never had a choice.